smug grin works its way across Leanne's face once more. If he's not going to admit to her, she knows that pushing him further is the only option for him to come clean.
Well then.
She laughs, shaking off the tipsy feeling from the booze.
You won't mind if I go introduce us then?
Scurrying behind Leanne as she heads towards Susan's table, Joe starts to freak out. "Leanne," Joe whispers purposefully, "please stop." Shuffling past people on the dance floor, Leanne ignores him. All she thinks about is those two women and why Joe is so desperate to avoid them. Scornfully looking in their direction, she's quick to notice how close and personal they are with each other. Things aren't adding up. "This is a bad idea," Joe announces, hiding behind Leanne, out of sight. Looking over her shoulder, Leanne gives Joe a dirty look. "Who are those women?" Blushing like crazy, Joe looks away and bites his lip. "Who are they, Joe?" Leanne repeats angrily, stopping in the middle of the dance floor. "I'm going to find out either way, so why don't you just tell me?" Several people dance close to Joe, causing him to wobble unsteady on his heels. Not sure how to answer, Joe pretends he doesn't hear her and that he's concentrating on not falling over. "Oh, fine," Leanne huffs, turning sharply. "I'll go find out for myself." Joe's heart sinks as Leanne pushes past a group dancing and disappears out of view. Taking a step, Joe feels a hand softly press against his side. "Dance with me, pretty girl," a soft and familiar voice shouts over the music. "No way in hell," Joe shouts back, disgusted at the hand gently making its way up his side. The person touching him towers over Joe. Their soft but firm hand on his side doesn't let him wiggle free. Glancing up, he sees that it's the same person that they spoke to outside in the queue. "You're a feisty one," the person laughs, gyrating their body closer to him as they put a second hand on his side. "But a little rude. I'm only trying to be welcoming to a new hatchling." Wanting this person to stop touching him as they are, Joe pushes away their hands. "Please don't touch me like that," Joe complains, scowling. The person lets go and swiftly brings their hands away and down to their sides. "I'm sorry," she replies sheepishly. "I just can't get you out of my mind. You're the prettiest girl I've seen, and I wanted to ask for your advice." She touches her stomach and frowns. "No matter what I do, I've always got a little pudge around my belly. It's so unflattering." They move down to touch Joe's flat stomach, but Joe flinches away. "You're so skinny," she exclaims, clearly jealous. "How do you do it? How do you keep yourself so trim and feminine? Are you wearing a corset?" Looking down at himself in Leanne's long flowing dress, Joe sighs. Being called feminine and trim is not what he's been going to the gym to achieve. Plus, he doesn't want to be reminded of the fact he's wearing the underwear he's brought for Susan. "Exercise," Joe flippantly replies, shrugging his shoulders as he backs away. "Core is super important," he shouts back, looking nervously over his shoulder as he sneaks past another group dancing to escape. Moving as quickly as he dares to in the heels he's been forced to wear, Joe stumbles in the direction he thinks Leanne was heading. However, he's all turned around. Looking in every direction possible, Joe fears the worst. Gritting his teeth tight together, Joe can already hear the comments he's going to get from his colleagues at work. He's not going to be able to look Susan in the eye anymore. As his heart races, he can't help but feel foolish standing in the middle of this club wearing nothing but his girlfriend's clothing. He feels the long hair cascading down his back and the weight of his chest as he starts to wonder if Leanne is worth it. Like a bolt out of the blue, a hand reaches out from the crowd and grips Joe's wrists tight. Worried for a moment he's been followed, Joe is relieved to see it's Leanne dragging him out of the crowd. Scared for what might have happened in their absence from each other, Joe is gobsmacked to see Leanne grinning back at him with the widest smile. "There you are!" Leanne shouts over the music. "I'm glad you're feeling more comfortable here, but it's not time to dance. Come sit with us." Bemused, Joe thought that when he found Leanne again, she'd want to knock his head off. Unless she's guiding him to certain death, this is not what he expected from her. Making their way off the dance floor, Joe is pulled in front of the table that Susan sits at. Glancing at Susan, he moves to hide behind Leanne as much as possible. "I found him!" Leanne sings, letting go of Joe's wrist. He was dancing! He's never been a big dancer. I can't believe it. I feel like I barely know my own boyfriend right now. All I had to do, Leanne giggles, was put him in a dress, sexy undies, and some heels. Smiling at Joe's annoyed reaction as her hands wander across his feminized body, Leanne sits. Joe stands gracelessly as the three women look up at him. He feels like he's in front of a firing squad. He doesn't know whether he should smile or run for the hills. The one thing he does know is that he can't leave Leanne with Susan for too long. Hi, Joe, Susan shouts over the table, massively surprised to see him dressed as he is. You look incredible in that dress. Joe can't bring himself to say anything. He's too embarrassed that his secretary is witnessing him dressed as he is. At that moment, Joe gets a small taster of what it must be like for a woman, as Susan's eyes take in his every curve. Joe! Leanne taunts, patting the seat next to her in the booth. I know you want to show yourself off, but sit next to me already. Reluctantly, Joe lifts his dress and sits. All three women stare intently at him as he does. Wow, Susan smiles directly at him. That was surprisingly ladylike for you, Joe. Wasn't it? Leanne agrees strongly. Joe lowers his head and hopes things can't get worse. I never expected this at all, Susan laughs, giggling loudly. My boss? In here, of all places? Dressed like such an elegant woman. Elegant? Joe sneers under his breath. Don't be rude, Leanne leans over to whisper into his ear. Susan just paid you a compliment. Annoyed, Joe looks up at Susan's silly grin. Thanks. Oh, Susan responds, nervously gesturing to the lady unknown to Joe who sits beside her. I'm so in awe of your beauty, boss, that I've forgotten to introduce you to my friend. The woman beside Susan reacts poorly to her comments. Friend? She whines, giving her a death stare. Don't you mean your girlfriend? Shocked to his core, Joe looks up at the short-haired woman sitting next to her. Girlfriend? Joe mutters, rudely staring, like she's got something in her teeth. Hey, Susan's girlfriend awkwardly waves, reacting nervously to Joe's intense staring. I'm Tallulah, but everyone just calls me Lula. Joe glances quickly at Susan, and her face has gone bright red. He can tell she's getting nervous, too. Girlfriend? Joe mutters again in disbelief, but this time louder. Confused and made to feel very uncomfortable by Joe's looming eyes, Lula leans over to Leanne. Is she okay? Lula asks, remaining in eye contact with Joe the entire time. I feel like I've done something wrong. Leanne secretly nudges Joe under the table with her leg. No! Leanne nervously laughs, replying to Lula. I think Joe's just having a really big day. As I said moments ago, he came out to me today. Oh, right, Lula says, leaning away. Still glaring angrily, all the promises that Susan has made to Joe come to the forefront of his mind. They were supposed to be going on a naughty weekend, and now he finds out she's got a girlfriend? Pointing a suspicious finger at Lula, Joe glares in Susan's direction. How long have you two been together? He asks through gritted teeth, trying his best to seem cool about it. Susan shies away from the question, but Lula doesn't. We've been together for... Lula looks at Susan for clarification, but gets none. You okay, hun? Lula asks, focusing on Susan's odd behavior. Yup, Susan swiftly answers Lula, as her eyes dart between Lula and Joe. 7 years, she blurts. We've been together for 7 years. Joe grips the table edge with his fingernails. That's wonderful, he answers, hiding the fact he wants to blow his top. That's before you started working for me, Joe comments. Joe leans in towards Susan. Why didn't you mention this? Joe questions fiercely, trying to suppress his feelings of betrayal. Leanne puts a hand on Joe's shoulder to pull him back. Joe, she says softly, reacting to his behavior. She might be your employee, but she doesn't have to tell you everything. So she's got a girlfriend. What does that matter to you? Sitting back, Joe looks at Leanne's suspicious expression, and instantly his demeanor changes. He's not been subtle at all. He chuckles nervously. I was just curious. It's not a problem, Lula asks bluntly. Us being together, is it? Joe looks up, knowing he may have faux pas'd by accident. Nope, he answers quickly. Just a little surprised, is all. Leanne laughs nervously as she places a comforting hand on Joe's shoulder. See? She says, looking at both Susan and Lula. He's fine. I think he's just nervous. Aren't you, Joe? Nervous. Yeah. Joe bashfully laughs it off, looking directly at Susan. It's just quite the surprise that Susan has never mentioned you, Lula. Lula turns to Susan and gives her a suspicious look. That is a little strange, she admits, causing Susan to look away anxiously. Why is that? Taking longer to answer than expected, the tension between Lula and Susan is very noticeable. You know, she answers unconvincingly. No, Lula replies. I don't. Are you ashamed of me? Susan desperately takes hold of Lula. No, babe, it's nothing like that. Well, what is it then? Lula asks, clearly torn by the news. Susan looks at Joe and knows she's between a rock and a hard place. Joe looks on as he secretly seethes internally. You know his reputation in the company, Susan explains, pointing at Joe but looking over at Leanne with concern. Her reputation? Joe laughs off, looking worried about Leanne's reaction to what Susan is saying. Lula softly smiles at Susan before turning to face Joe. Yeah, I work downstairs in shipping, and even I know you've got a reputation as a bit of an arse, Joe. Sorry. An arse? Joe shrieks, looking at Susan to back him up that he is not an arse. Lula turns to Leanne. Sorry, darling, she says. Your boyfriend here is known to be a bit of a womanizer and a massive user. I'm surprised Susan's been able to work with him all this time. Lula then looks sheepishly at Joe and tilts her head. After seeing you looking so cute as a girl, Joe, she says humorously, I'm now even more worried about you working with my girlfriend. Susan and Joe give each other a telling look. Nah, they speak in unison. We'd never do anything like that. Lula's expression turns sour. You're acting really weird, she says to Susan before turning to Leanne. You want to get these girls some drinks? Lula says to Leanne, pointing at Joe and then Susan. I think these two clearly need to talk privately. I don't know about Joe, but Susan's defo acting weird.